My background that gives me some insight is I've been involved in health policy for the last decade, and I've been the AUA RUC member since 2016. So I think that you need to understand a little bit about the RUC to get at this question. So the resource-based relative value scale is the way that doctors get paid in the United States. And it's really based on resource costs to provide service, not based on charges. So if you take the whole pie, or one RVU, if you will, about 48% of that is physician work, 48% is practice expense, which is supplies, clinical staff time, et cetera, and 4% professional liability insurance. So when you look at the RUC, basically the goal of the RUC is to provide RVU recommendations to CMS. Most private insurers follow what Medicare and Medicaid do, but this is the makeup of the RUC. There are 28 voting members. You see urology is one of them. New York Times and Washington Post wrote articles a couple years ago sort of implying that the RUC is this group of old surgeons fixing prices for payment in the US, but you see medicine's well represented: internal medicine, geriatrics, pediatrics, et cetera. So my last slide on the RUC is I want to show you a little bit what it's like. So the woman in the red, sort of the judges sit at the head of the table. The jury are the sides of the table. They're the RUC members that vote on these codes. And then the group up by the slide projector are the societies that present. And this happens to be the GI team, and I think it's illustrative in the following way. A few years ago, they had some new contraption where they could take a polyp off in a different way. And I think it was somewhat driven by industry to get a new code. And the problem is that when you bring a new code to the RUC, it triggers review of the entire family. So every colonoscopy code had to be reviewed. And although some of the newer technology ones had decent value, the base code of colonoscopy or colonoscopy with biopsy went down. And so I think that societies really have to think carefully about this when they're going for new codes. So to the task at hand, and you're going to hear a little bit of conflicting information from me compared to the last talk, but MRI fusion biopsy, this was actually addressed by an AUA policy and advocacy brief in 2017. And what prompted that is this MRI code was being billed increasingly by urologists, and that was felt to be miscoding, and I'll talk about why. But this policy brief said 76872 transrectal ultrasound appropriate, 55700 prostate biopsy appropriate, and then 76942 is the guidance code. CMS subsequently determined that the two ultrasound codes can't be billed together due to Medicare National Correct Coding Bundling Edit, whatever that means. So now going through some of these MRI codes, there's MRI pelvis without, MRI pelvis with. By far their most commonly reported is the MRI pelvis with and without contrast. And then they also have two 3D rendering codes. The most common would be the one at the very bottom, 76377, which is 3D rendering with image post-processing. So here are a couple caveats. Again, that article was prompted by this 77021, and that code is MRI guidance for needle placement, but sort of the CPT descriptor and definition of that code is the needles have to be placed while the patient's in the MRI machine. So it's usually incorrect coding if done by urology. Certainly there are urologists that own MRI machines, but the vast majority is probably incorrect coding. And then final caveat would be CPT 76498 is an MRI unlisted code. And it really does seem that this would be a reasonable code in effort to capture increased work over regular transrectal ultrasound of fusing the MRI and the ultrasound images. But AUA experience in talking to their members is that this code is not usually reimbursed. So some take-home messages for the MRI fusion biopsy. So for urology, 76872 has a little higher RVU than the ultrasound guidance code. So at least in the Medicare population, that'd be the proper one to use. 55700 is prostate biopsy. And then one can try for the MRI unlisted, but probably unlikely to be reimbursed. You see there that's 3.19 RVUs for the urologist presently. Then if you look at the radiology codes, it's usually the MRI pelvis with and without at 2.2 RVU, and this 3D rendering with image post-processing, which is 0.79. So they make roughly 2.99 RVU on this procedure. So what is going to be the future? And I think that this has been addressed before, dating back to even like 2013. And radiology is really pushed back against trying to get a new code, because if a new code goes forward, it's going to trigger a review of a large family of MRI codes. From a urology perspective, I think that it doesn't make sense as long as transrectal ultrasound is the vast majority of biopsies, because there is extra work in MRI fusion, no doubt about it, and it would come out with a bit of a higher RVU. But say if it's 20% of all biopsies, 80% that are done the transrectal ultrasound way are very likely to go down, as this is a budget neutral system. And then finally, this is an active issue in that CPT representatives from the AUA, which are Ron Kaufman and Jonathan Rubenstein, are meeting with ACR representatives this week to revisit this issue. And we initially think that possibly altering the description of the 3D rendering codes might allow urology to account for extra work in MRI fusion without triggering full review of MRI pelvis codes or prostate biopsy codes. So it's a work in progress, but I thank you all for your attention.